In fiscal year 2021, federal grants to state and local governments exceeded $1.2 trillion. That money came with conditions. To understand how that arrangement came to exist, you have to go back to a single year, 1913, and two votes that state legislators cast voluntarily, by wide margins, in their own chambers. The Constitution of 1787 created two largely separate systems of government with two separate funding mechanisms. The federal government raised money primarily through tariffs on imported goods and excise taxes. According to Internal Revenue Service records, from 1868 to 1913, roughly 90% of all federal revenue came from taxes on liquor, beer, wine, and tobacco. There was no individual income tax. The IRS, as it exists today, did not yet exist. States funded themselves through property taxes. In 1913, property taxes made up 38.9% of all state revenue. Local governments drew 77.4% of their revenue from that same source. The two systems were largely non-competing, operating in separate fiscal economies. The political structure reflected that separation. Before 1913, United States senators were not chosen by popular vote. They were appointed by state legislatures. James Madison, writing in Federalist No. 62, described this as giving state governments direct agency in shaping the federal government. George Mason argued at the Constitutional Convention that it gave states a mechanism for resisting federal overreach. If a senator voted against a state's interests, the legislature that appointed him could pressure or replace him. The states held direct leverage over the federal body. That was the structure in place at the start of 1913. The 16th Amendment authorized Congress to levy a federal income tax without apportioning it among the states by population. Congress had proposed it in 1909, and the political calculation behind it was notable. Conservative Republicans, led by Senator Nelson Aldrich, supported sending it to the states largely because they expected it would fail during ratification. State legislatures, they believed, would never grant the federal government a new taxing power. That assumption proved wrong. By February 3, 1913, 42 of 48 state legislatures had ratified the amendment. Only 3 states voted no: Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Utah. On April 8, 1913, 64 days later, 36 states ratified the 17th Amendment, replacing legislative appointment of senators with direct popular election. Across all 36 ratifying states, only 191 individual legislators voted against it. The amendment moved from proposal to ratification in under 11 months. The Heritage Foundation later described this as a moment that critically altered the balance of power between state governments and the federal government. Both amendments addressed documented, widely acknowledged problems. By 1913, corporate interests had, in several states, effectively captured the legislative process for selecting senators. Partisan deadlocks over appointments had left some states without full Senate representation for years. The 17th Amendment offered a direct remedy. The 16th Amendment was designed to shift the federal tax burden away from regressive tariffs, which fell most heavily on lower-income Americans, and toward higher earners. When the first income tax took effect, the exemption threshold was $3,000 for individuals and $4,000 for married couples. Average annual income at the time was roughly $750. Less than 1% of Americans owed any tax under the initial rates. These were broadly popular reforms, supported by millions of voters and the legislators who represented them. For major structural changes were enacted within that same calendar year. The 16th Amendment was ratified on February 3rd. The 17th was ratified on April 8th. The Revenue Act of 1913, creating the first income tax under the new amendment, was signed on October 3rd. The Federal Reserve Act was signed on December 23rd. All 4 were passed by the same Congress and signed by the same president, Woodrow Wilson, within 323 days. Federal grants to states began almost immediately. According to the Congressional Research Service, federal grants totaled $12 million in fiscal year 1913. By 1922, that figure had grown to $118 million. Congress created new programs for highway construction, vocational education, public health, and maternity care. Each program came with requirements. States had to submit plans for federal approval, match federal funds with their own contributions, and accept oversight for Washington. The pattern that emerged, federal money flowing to states in exchange for compliance with federal standards, has persisted and grown ever since. New Deal programs in the 1930s expanded federal grants into the billions. Great Society programs in the 1960s and 70s expanded them further. By 2021, federal funds represented 36.7% of all state government revenue, the highest share recorded since the Census Bureau began tracking the figure in 1972. Over the same period, property taxes fell from 38.9% of state revenue in 1913 to 1.8% by 1999. States did not replace that revenue with new independent sources. Federal grants filled much of the gap. Meanwhile, the federal tax code grew from 400 pages in 1913 to 73,954 pages by 2013. The first Form 1040 was 4 pages long, including 1 page of instructions. A question researchers have raised. Legal scholar David Schleicher, writing in 2014, examined why state legislatures moved so quickly to give up the power to appoint senators, with almost no recorded debate. Today, states depend on federal funding to operate core services. Medicaid alone now constitutes 56% of all federal grants to states. Governors regularly weigh whether to accept or reject federal programs, but those negotiations happen within a fiscal framework built on dependency that has accumulated over a century. The vote tallies from 1913 are preserved in public records. 191 legislators across the country voted against the 17th Amendment. The rest voted yes. The 3 states that rejected the 16th Amendment, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Utah, were outnumbered 42-3. No state was coerced. No amendment was imposed. The restructuring of American federalism in 1913 was accomplished through the ordinary machinery of democratic ratification by the states themselves in their own capitals with votes that were, at the time, largely expected to fix real and visible problems. Whether the long-term consequences were foreseeable is a question historians and legal scholars continue to debate.